Awesome. All right, so I'm going to let everyone in. Okay, good morning, everybody. So full disclosure, friends, I just said good morning, and I count that as a win because I am joining you from Pennsylvania, where it is actually the afternoon right now. So I will try my best to remember the time zone differences and share accordingly. But just in case I mess up, you know why. I am joining you currently from a very snowy State College, Pennsylvania. So I'm not sure if how the weather is where everybody is now, but it is cold and snowy where I am. All right, so we'll let everybody, it looks like some people are still joining with their sound, and we'll give everybody just a minute to kind of join the session too. In the chat while we're doing this, while we're kind of waiting to get started, if you want to kind of share, I'm assuming that everybody here is from Nevada, but if you want to share kind of where you're from, what you teach, grade level, everything, anything that you want to share with me just as a way to kind of start to get to know everybody, I would love that. Lori, that is totally fine. If you just want to engage with the chat, I appreciate that, or you can unmute yourself and share that way too. But otherwise, just take a minute, like I said, just share who you are, where you're joining us from, what grade you teach, what subject you teach, all of the above. And then we will get started in just a minute. We will have, just full disclosure, and I will mention this again as we do kind of our introductory piece, we will have some opportunity for some kind of audience participation during the session today. And I welcome any type of participation that you are willing to share with me. So if you want to turn on your camera and share, verbally, fantastic. If you want to share in the chat, that's totally fine too. It is a Saturday morning where you are, and you are amazing educators willing to share your time and expertise with us. So I am willing to meet you wherever you are willing to share with me. All right. U.S. History, 11th grade, fantastic. Las Vegas, Social Studies, 6th grade. Gabriel, welcome. Joe is an AP U.S. History teacher, fantastic. What does CCSD stand for? You are the second person who's used that. What does that acronym
Clark
stand for?
County School District.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenny. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Lori teaches U.S. history to 11th grade. Awesome. And American government to 12th grade. Students at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia every year. Oh, Lori, that's awesome. So March 2nd, I will add it on my calendar so that I'll be there so that we can come and say hi. All right, wonderful. So with that, let's get started because I know we only have until 10:15 in our session today. So first and foremost, again, good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah Harris, and I am the Director of Education at the National Constitution Center, which is the photograph in front of you right now. I am so excited to be with you all today as we talk about the 14th Amendment and storytelling and all of our practices surrounding that. As I mentioned before, I welcome any type of audience participation that you are willing to share with me. There are some instances built into the session today, but throughout our brief time together, please feel free to send any questions, any insights, any connections in the chat as you see fit. I will kind of check it periodically because if I leave it open all the time, I'll get distracted. But we will kind of, build that into the time together that we have. So here is a brief kind of overview of what we'll cover during our time together. So we'll do some welcome and introductions, not just of myself, but also the National Constitution Center. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, we're kind of far away from one another, so I like to share a little bit of information about the museum itself, but I also like to share kind of why we create the resources that we do in such the way that we do. I think it just gives a little bit more context for some of the things that I'll share and we'll go over today too. Then we'll jump right into kind of the content around this. So we'll talk about the 14th Amendment's text. We'll talk about storytelling. We'll go over some resources that we have. We'll engage with some of those resources. And then hopefully at the end, there will be ample time for questions and connections. I will also share my email address in the chat at the end of our session so that if we don't have that time, or as you move through the course of the day, if you have any questions that pop into your head, you have the opportunity to ask me. So like I said, I'm Sarah. I'm the Director of Education at the center. I've been at the center now for about 4.5 years. And prior to that, I was a high school history teacher at a school in Burlington, New Jersey. So I taught freshman history, which was, U.S. history. And I taught there for about 5 years. So my background is in history and secondary education. All right. At the beginning of all of these sessions as well, I always like to include some kind of expectations. As I mentioned, we will have tons of times to engage with one another through questions and answers and just kind of sharing some ideas. And in order to kind of all start at the same place, I like to share these expectations that I've gathered throughout the past couple of years, either as a facilitator or as a participant in some Zoom sessions and in-person sessions. So I'm going to encourage everybody to do in just a moment. I will stop speaking and give you a chance to read through all of these bullet points. And I want you to pick the one that resonates with you the most for any reason. Maybe it's one that you've seen before. Maybe it's one that you haven't seen before, or it's something that you use, but call it something different. But I'm going to give everybody a minute to read through them. And in our very first, very low stakes form of audience participation, I'm going to ask you to share with me in the chat the one that you picked and why, if you're so inclined to do that. So take a minute and read through them, and then I'll ask you to share whenever you're ready in the chat. All right. Wonderful, Laurie. So Laurie said, come to engage with other people and other ideas. I love that, especially when we're talking about something like the 14th Amendment that is so broad and includes a history of so many people. So I really appreciate that one. New ideas and contacts, Laurie, I agree. Joe said, listen, reflect, and support. What great words. Absolutely. Gabriel said, come to engage. Yep, I agree with that one. That one's one of my favorites too. Jenny said, listen to learn. That one's wonderful too. So again, I always like to kind of share these just because it helps us all start from the same place, especially, as I mentioned, when we're going to kind of share and engage with everybody else. Jose said, assume good intent, and that is also one of my favorites. So thank you all so much. Like I said, pretty low stakes for audience participation, but I always love to hear a little bit about what you all have to share at the beginning as well. So keep them coming, keep sending them. But I'm going to share a little bit about the National Constitution Center. So I know that Laurie has been there before. Has anybody else been to Philadelphia or to the center in the past? Feel free to use a reaction if you are, interested in doing that way. Nope. Jose says, yes, fantastic, awesome. 8 times, Laurie, wow, you're a champ. All right. So we are a physical museum space, as you saw by the picture in the opening slide. We were chartered by Congress in 1988 to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis in close proximity to Independence Hall. So if we look back at this picture that I shared before, if you were the one taking this picture, directly behind you would be Independence Hall. So that part of our mission we have accomplished, right? Check and check. The other part of our mission, sharing information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis, is admittedly a little bit more difficult, but it's something that we take very seriously. And it's something that I hope that you will see kind of built into all of the resources and information that I share with you today. We've definitely included this part of our mission in in the process of creating some of these resources that I'll share, which again, I will discuss in just a little bit. But it is something that we really take to heart and keep in mind in everything that we do. Even though we were chartered by Congress in 1988, that charter did not include any funding. So it took us a little bit of time to officially open our doors, which we did on July 4th, 2003. So we've been open at this point for a little over 19 years as a physical museum in Philadelphia. Now, I told you that we take this kind of nonpartisan part of our mission very seriously. And the way that we take that huge mission that's kind of institution-wide, and we boil that down to what we do in the education department, is shared in this slide right here. And we'll talk a little bit about all of these components throughout our session today too. So we start with historical foundations through storytelling, which closely connects to the topic of what we'll talk about today. But I venture a guess, and I think it's a pretty safe guess, that in a Zoom room full of educators, we all could probably name the thing that we love to teach about or learn about or share about pretty quickly, right? We probably have that already in our minds. And there is a part of teaching that is inherently connected to storytelling. And so that's the way that we engage students with kind of the historical contexts necessary to understand all of these components of constitutional change, right? So the example that I often give is you need to understand the progressive era in order to understand the 18th Amendment, right? That's just part of that kind of constitutional understanding. And the way that we do that, again, is through storytelling, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Once students have that historical foundation, then we can start to move to the Constitution itself. So we dive into that with constitutional thinking skills. And these are really any tools that students need in order to engage with the Constitution or any primary source, right? What vocabulary supports do they need? What kind of close reading skills do they need? What do they need in terms of their own kind of toolbox in order to look at the Constitution, understand it, and start to build their own ideas about it? And then finally, once they have all of these ideas, how do they talk about it? So what tools do students need and teachers need to support them to develop civil dialogue in the classroom and to develop the skills necessary to reflect on those things that they've heard in the classroom or their own personal understandings of these ideas? So all of these components are kind of reflected in, again, almost everything that we do, and in a variety of different ways. And we'll dive into some of those a little bit today. So one of the ways that we really kind of connect the dots here, right? We connect these historic foundations through storytelling and constitutional thinking skills and all of the above, is that we deal in what we call constitutional questions as opposed to political questions. Now, is there anybody who would like to unmute themselves and read the definition of political question for me? And I can't see everybody at once, so just feel free to just unmute yourself and do it if you are so inclined to share with us that way. And if not, that's fine. I know it's a big ask. It's early.
A political question is an issue of what the government or a government entity or agent should do.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. And is there anybody who would like to unmute themselves and share the definition of a constitutional question for me?
A constitutional question is an issue of what the government or a government entity or agent constitutionally may do.
Thank you. So the difference here is literally very small, right? It's just one word difference, but the bigger kind of gain from changing the question type here is where we're going to drive students to find the answers and how students are going to frame the answers to these questions. So let me give you a specific here. So a specific example of this is a political question would be, should a public school principal search a student's locker? The constitutional version of this question is, does the Fourth Amendment restrict the power of a government employee from searching a student's locker? Now, I want you just to take a minute again and just kind of reflect on the differences in these questions. Think about how your students might answer one or both of these questions, what support they would offer, how they might react to them. So take a minute and think about it, and feel free to send your answers through the chat or unmute yourself if you are so inclined and share that way as well. So I'll send the question in the chat too. How would your students react to these questions? So think about it, send your ideas through the chat, or like I said, feel free to unmute yourself as well. And I can say that one of the big things that we often talk about when we talk about these two questions specifically is kind of the discussions that will come out of asking these questions, right? Because theoretically, if you're going to drive students to the Constitution itself or to any specific source, the fear is that it's not going to elicit a very rich discussion, right? And so kind of discussing and parsing through the ways that these constitutional questions still allow for students to participate and engage in a really kind of meaningful discussion point. All right, so Ladarius says my students would all respond no to the political question, right? Maybe like just really quickly, just no, straight up, hard stop, no. Absolutely. My students would confuse the two. Yeah, absolutely. They would be very passionate about the first one because they would feel like it affects them directly since it uses a principal and a student's locker. Thank you. I asked these questions. I was just in Oklahoma recently doing a session and come to find out that they don't use lockers in their schools in Oklahoma. So I have to come up with an alternative question here. But yes, it is theoretically very personally connected to the students. All over the first question with tons of ideas and responses from everyone. The second question, most would struggle to answer that one. And Laurie, that's a really great point, because in order to answer it, you need to understand so many other things, right? You need to understand what the Fourth Amendment says. You need to understand what case law says and why it's important that it's a public school versus a private school, or, what case law specifically about schools in general have said. So there's more pieces to it. Second question would be less passionate. That's a really fantastic word. Thank you so much for introducing that. It would start a debate, teach US history. We look at New Jersey versus TLO. Awesome. And then you can kind of use that as a point to redirect student opinion. More difficult for students to answer, for sure. Absolutely. And I so appreciate that that's how kind of we're framing this. And it kind of connects really nicely into this idea of storytelling that we'll dive into in just a moment, because it's more difficult for students if they don't have those supports necessary to know how to answer these questions, right? So kind of framing and providing those resources is what we do, right? Making sure that students understand the stories behind New Jersey versus TLO, understand what the Constitution says and giving them the tools that they need to read the Fourth Amendment and understand what some of those words mean. So with all of those supports, those questions, while it might still be difficult, it might be a little bit easier than just kind of going into it blind. So I so appreciate those answers. Thank you. So when we're talking about a topic like the 14th Amendment, right, not only is it one of, if not the longest amendment in the US Constitution, but it also has such an impact on so many different groups of people for so many different reasons. And one of the reasons why we deal in constitutional questions specifically is to make sure that we can empower students to have tough conversations, right? So how can we provide students with the resources that they need to talk about these really, frankly, big constitutional topics in a way that remains civil and respectful? And so that's why we often deal, or at least, empower students to start with the constitutional versions of these questions. And in dealing with something like the 14th Amendment, it might be difficult to do because of its long history, because of its impacts throughout history. So one of the things that I can share are just some constitutional questions that we have around the 14th Amendment to kind of start this conversation on storytelling relating to it. So some of the questions that we could ask students, and again, these are all constitutionally based, but still open the door for students to be able to engage in a meaningful way, and to kind of include their own experiences and discussion points in some of these topics too. So what does the 14th Amendment say? What core principles does it add to the Constitution? How did it transform the Constitution? How does it promote equality and protect freedom? And what are some questions or areas, of ongoing constitutional debate? So again, all of these kind of remain true to the nonpartisan part of our mission and still allow for students to dive into this amendment in a really big way. And the way that we always start these conversations, maybe not surprisingly, is with the Constitution itself. So let's start this process together. So we're going to look at the 14th Amendment here. And so it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's a mouthful. And this is just the first of 5 sections, right? So one of the things that we would do in kind of engaging with students on this amendment itself would be to just look at the language, right? To look at these words and kind of start to identify points of confusion or points of support, right? Words and ideas that students really feel confident and comfortable with, and those words in which they do not. The other part, and we'll kind of use this as our kind of warm-up activity here, that we also dive into is section 5. And this one is obviously much shorter. The Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislations the provisions of this article. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Let me go back here. We're going to start looking at all of this. So I'm going to just make my screen share a little bit bigger. Do that. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share this Google slide with everybody, and hopefully everybody has the ability to edit. Yep, looks like you do. All right. I'm going to send this through the chat. I'm going to encourage everybody, if you are, again, so inclined, to open it up. And you can look at either section 1 or section 5, whichever one you want to start with. And just go in. Everybody is going to have access to the same document. Looks like I have some people in here. Fantastic. So go in and throughout this process, confirm for me that you can actually edit this. But I'm going to encourage you to kind of look at this and maybe highlight if you highlight a word here and then select the, highlight button, whatever you would like, identify a couple of words or phrases or ideas that you think are essential in kind of going through this with your students, or that you think your students might have some questions about right off the bat. You would have to kind of identify these in order to help them, help them kind of go through that. All of it. We're highlighting all of it. Just kidding. That's totally fine. And Jose, that's a fantastic point. So Jose just shared, I thought the 14th Amendment was primarily written to allow prior enslaved people to have equal rights. And that's wonderful. And we're going to talk about that as we talk about the stories that we want to share, right? So during the Reconstruction time period, the first of these amendments that are ratified is the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And there's this idea that in abolishing slavery, it will kind of take care of this issue of what to do then with this population of people coming into the country as citizens, right? That once slavery is abolished, that the population of formerly enslaved people would enter into society in the same way as anybody else. However, one of the things that was not well defined in the Constitution prior to the 14th Amendment was what it meant to be a citizen, right? And this is the question that we often engage students with when we're talking about the 14th Amendment is, what are your rights and responsibilities as a citizen? And it wasn't necessarily a national citizenship standard that was included in the Constitution. You were certainly a citizen of your state, and you had the rights and responsibilities that went along with being a citizen of New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Nevada. But there was nothing, and to some extent, your rights had to apply even as you crossed state lines. But there was nothing else in the Constitution that really said, this is what it means to be a United States citizen. And this is what it means to be, part of that group of people. And this is how we're going to define it. So once the 13th Amendment is ratified, and there really isn't this kind of, opening up of opportunity for the formerly enslaved population to get all of these rights and responsibilities, then we start discussing the 14th Amendment as well, right? And we start kind of identifying those things that we need to add to the Constitution that would guarantee the rights of the formerly enslaved, but it would also guarantee the rights of everybody who was coming into the country or born into the country in the future. So the 14th Amendment itself, absolutely, the time period, the historical, context of the time period drove a lot of this language, specifically drove a lot of the need for this language, and definitely played a role in defining those rights that the formerly enslaved population specifically got. And I will share, if I have time, and if I don't, please remind me or email me, but we have an online interactive called the drafting table that shows the changes that were made to the language of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as it moved through the approval and ratification process. So what is included in this, what you'll see in this drafting table online interactive is the broad range of rights that were explicitly defined in the 14th Amendment, and then kind of how it changed and what was taken out and what was edited and what was added and things like that as well. Because the 14th Amendment has, like I said, 5 sections. So some of these other sections, there's a section that deals with voting, even before the 15th Amendment was ratified. The section specifically is the first time that we see the word male entered into the Constitution. So when this was ratified in the 1860s, 1960s, you had the women's suffrage movement really angry that the word male was inserted in the Constitution, guaranteeing the right to vote for any male over the age of 21. And to be fair, it didn't necessarily guarantee that right. What it did is it took away the congressional representation in states that denied males over the age of 21 the right to vote. It was never enforced. States still did it, but inserting that word male into the Constitution made a lot of women in the women's suffrage movement fearful that it would move their movement back by decades. And they weren't wrong, right? Women don't get the right to vote until 1920. So while it certainly isn't just due to that part of the 14th Amendment, it certainly wasn't helped by that fact either. So there's lots of big ideas in this, right? And this kind of comes to this point of, what do we talk about? How do we share these stories, and how do we make these decisions of the stories to share when the 14th Amendment itself has such a rich history and rich pieces to it that have impacted not just the text that we see here, but also its interpretation and application since its ratification in the 1860s. Okay, so some of the words that we have highlighted: naturalized, we underlined jurisdiction, abridges the privileges or immunities, that's highlighted and underlined. We have due process and equal protection. These are fantastic pieces to highlight. And take a minute in the chat, again, if you are so inclined, and share why you highlighted these key terms, why you highlighted these ideas specifically. Excuse me, again, they're going to kind of inform what we decide that we're going to share with our students and how we're going to share that information with them as well. Okay, and as you are kind of taking a moment to share that in the chat, let's get back to this topic, right? And kind of what we're talking about, because the four big features of the 14th Amendment that we highlight in any program that we do on this, and I'll share some insight about some of the online programs that we offer. These are really the big four things that we talk about, and everybody really highlighted them already in the amendment, which is fantastic. Birthright citizenship, protection of equality, protection of freedom, and that Congress is given more power. So these are the four big features of the 14th Amendment that we talk about when we share research about this or share our insights in this. So Naomi, is that how you say your name? I'm so sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly. Please feel free to correct me. I will take no offense to it. Students understand these things because they have a tendency to stop if they feel words are too difficult. Yeah. In middle school, absolutely. Right. So how do we really empower students to know how these words are defined in a way that makes them feel confident in sharing their insights about this? That's awesome. Joe said substantive versus procedural due process. Absolutely. Always confuses students. Ladarius didn't highlight naturalization, but I know that their students has a lot of questions about what that meant, right? And there are, again, I will keep referencing these programs, but when we talk about things like citizenship and naturalization, there are several key Supreme Court cases that we highlight, right? Before the ratification of the 14th Amendment, any question of citizenship has to include the story of Dred Scott, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But post 14th Amendment, we talk about the Wong Kim Ark case, right? And the fact that he is a person who was born in the United States and his parents weren't, and how that impacted his questions of citizenship. But naturalization is certainly a whole other process that kind of is connected to this question as well. Some vocabulary, says Lori, is difficult for kids, and beyond that, the concepts contained are difficult. Absolutely, right? These are not just big concepts in the world of in the realm of real world application, but if we think about how the courts have interpreted and reinterpreted the 14th Amendment over time, it's not something that has necessarily come easy to that as well. One of the things that I often love to talk about students with is that the 14th Amendment, the same 14th Amendment that said that separate but equal was constitutional with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, also said that separate but equal was not constitutional under the Brown versus Board of Education case. So how do we get students to rectify that, right? To understand that shift, that it's the same exact words in the Constitution, but it can be used to justify these two entirely different, quite frankly, opposite ideologies and thought processes. So Laurie, that's absolutely right. What the word meant. Yeah. Yes, Ladarius, absolutely, for naturalization. Noheem, thank you. Noeem. All right, no. That's okay. I just want to make sure that if I'm going to say it, I at least ask how to say it. So these are fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. And like I said, it's a really, really big topic. So in engaging with the 14th Amendment, right, it's important for our students to not just know what all of these words mean, but the way that we do that, and the way that is, quite frankly, proven effective is through storytelling. And with the 14th Amendment itself, we have so many rich stories that are connected to it, right? Any Supreme Court case, any of the Supreme Court cases that we've mentioned already, all come with their own background and built-in stories to them. And the issue then is, how do we know which ones to tell? And how do we choose those most effective to tell in order to engage with our students in the best possible way? So I'm going to, so here's some questions, right? So as we kind of transition into talking about storytelling specifically, I'm encouraging you to kind of think about some stories that are important in both life and in the classroom. And what are some benefits and drawbacks to using stories to teach about history and government? And, if you teach any other class within social studies, please feel free to connect this to your own discipline. That would be fantastic. And then consider also the decisions that go into picking the stories to tell. And we will, again, kind of dive into some resources that empower students and educators alike to kind of pick out these stories and identify with these stories. But I want to start with kind of some of your own experiences and what you've done. So in order to do that, I've created a Jamboard. Hopefully we are familiar with that. And again, hopefully I did it right, so everybody has the editing and access abilities. So let's take a look at this. All right, so I have the questions that I highlighted in the PowerPoint. I have them just on 3 different slides here. If you're familiar with Jamboard, awesome. Feel free to kind of go through and start adding your responses. If you're not familiar with Jamboard, I got you covered. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a couple of options here. My personal favorite is the sticky note. If you click on that and type your answers, and then click save, your sticky note will appear. Okay, so you can do that on any of these 3 pages, but just take a minute, and I will not kind of keep this up on the screen so everybody can start to kind of really meaningfully work in their own way. But just look at those 3 different pages. You can scan by clicking on the carrots right up here. And just really, thank you so much. And I'll put the questions in total up here, but just take a moment. And again, I will stop talking so that you have an ability to think and share an answer to at least 1 or 2 of those questions. All right, let's take a look. All right, so some initial answers that we have: stories are so important in life and in the classroom, allows for multiple perspectives. Absolutely, right? Depending on your student population, they might not see themselves represented in a textbook or represented as frequently in a textbook, or they might not see themselves represented, in stories of history that they traditionally see on television. So allowing for stories inherently allows for multiple perspectives to be introduced into the classroom space. To capture the attention of students, absolutely. Some of my favorite stories that I used to tell to my students are even better than anything that could have possibly been made up from a movie, right? So we would often I talk about World War I, and some of the stories that came out of that, they wouldn't believe that actually happened, right? So capturing the attention of students is sometimes just all you need to really kind of drive student interest in the topic that you're teaching. I'm going to just move some of these because it looks like there's a bunch popping up. This is awesome. Oh, look at these amazing sticky notes. Help students relate to events in their own lives. Absolutely. Drawing connections, right? And somebody else put empathy, right? Kids don't fully develop the ability to reason until they're in their early 20s. So storytelling allows them to connect as children and care. Absolutely. Connect to the topic and stories help them remember. Absolutely. And stories can be relatable. Fantastic. I think I got them all. As we talk about some benefits too, students don't usually engage with the content of government and history in isolation, right? So they're engaging and making connections, listeners, and to understand the ideas beyond the abstract. A drawback can be that stories are usually anecdotal, and not necessarily representative of a wider experience, right? And so that consideration too of kind of the fear of making it appear that way can also be a little drawback. Many different concepts and developments, what I view as engaging, my students might not view as engaging. That's absolutely true. Thank you so much. It's why kind of building those relationships with your students are so essential. And then decisions that go into storytelling, right? It must be something that kids can relate to, engage with, and care about. It helps if it's a controversial or emotional story, right? If those components are inherently there too. And sometimes the decision-making process can be really difficult because if you are including one specific story, you are inherently not including, hundreds of others, right? So kind of figuring out the best stories to tell can be really difficult in allowing for multiple perspectives, right? So if you're kind of connecting all of these dots across all of these questions, that becomes even more difficult. And so what we do is we've created a couple of resources that we hope will help with that. And then also kind of have an activity that's helpful in allowing students to work through all of these decisions as well. Yeah, we always look at who was not represented, whose voice was not heard, right? So, and that again can go help students that are in your class as well. So as always, thank you all so much for sharing that. I will make sure that I think that there's a way for me to share all of these resources with you. So I'll make sure that everybody has access to this. If there's anything you want to go back to and reflect on or things like that as we move through this process as well. All right. So one of the resources that I love to share as we talk about this is in a couple of years ago, 2019 possibly, we opened an exhibit called Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. And in that kind of exhibit creation process, we also created a theater piece that complemented it called 14, which is what I'm going to show you a clip of today. The grant that we got that funded the development of this theater piece required that everything that is spoken by an actor has to come from a primary source. So in this clip I'm going to show you, it is a clip of Frederick Douglass and a letter that he wrote to his former enslaver. And everything that is spoken by an actor comes directly from a primary source, whether it's this letter, whether it's the Declaration of Independence. And we have a couple of clips in addition to this one that I can certainly share where to find that. But what this does, and I want you to kind of consider afterwards, is the benefits of using such a clip, but also kind of what your students' reactions might be to this, again, regardless of the subject or grade level that you teach. Okay, so let's watch this. I tested this out beforehand, folks, but please let me know if for any reason you can no longer hear it. It is a 4.5-minute clip, so it's not very long. But again, I'm going to encourage you to kind of share. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, sorry. Going back and forth here. All right. I'm going to encourage you to kind of think about the application for your students, to think about the questions you have or the connections that you build as we watch this. All right, sorry, folks. So Lori says she has nothing. Can anybody see? Can anybody see or hear it? Let me know. Nada. Oh,
No, we
man.
just see the Jamboard.
Okay. All right. Let me figure this out. Thank you all so much for letting me know. All right, here we go. Let's try this again. Okay. So do we see this
Yeah,
video?
we're good. Yep, we're good.
All right. Thank you, folks.
hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Declaration of Independence.
1776, 1787.
The United States Constitution is signed.
1787.
The Three-Fifths Clause of the United States Constitution. (1848). Frederick Douglass.
A letter to my old master, Thomas Auld. I am myself. You are yourself. We are two distinct persons, equal persons. What you are, I am. You are a man and so am I. God created both and made us separate beings. I am not by nature bound to you or you to me. Nature does not make your existence depend upon me or mine to depend upon yours. I cannot walk upon your legs or you upon mine. I cannot breathe for you or you for me. I must breathe for myself and you for yourself. We are distinct persons and are each equally provided with the faculties necessary to our individual existence. In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me, and in no way lessened your means for obtaining an honest living. Your faculties remained yours, and mine became useful to the rightful owner. I married soon after leaving you. I have an industrious and neat companion and 4 dear children. There are no slaveholders here to rend my heart by snatching them from my arms. Oh, sir, a slaveholder never appears to me so completely an agent of hell as when I think of and look upon my dear children. I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery, as a means of concentrating public attention on the system and deepening their horrors of the trafficking in the souls and bodies of men. I shall make use of you as a means of bringing this guilty nation with yourself to repentance. I am your fellow man, but not your slave. Frederick Douglass.
All right. Excuse me. So I shared that, there's multiple clips of these. So there's one on the debates around the ratification. There's one on the Black codes that took place after the ratification. There's one all about women in the Reconstruction time period. Every single one of these clips, though, has this type of slide at the end where it tells you what the primary sources were to allow you to be able to find them afterwards. I really like it, too, that it includes information about the music, because I think that music can be so powerful. So there's information about kind of where that is found and what that is as well. Okay. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about, what you kind of pulled out of it, what you think your students might pull out of it, what you think, what connections and things like that. Anything at all about the clip itself, or, what was shared within it. And again, feel free to share it through the chat or to unmute yourself and share verbally as well. And while you're doing that, I will send the link possibly to, I was going to send the link to it, but I think that that might be a little bit more difficult than I thought. So hearing someone read the primary sources with that type of commitment is so much more powerful than the kids reading it themselves. Yeah, so not just, thank you so much. And there's also something to be said, and I know that we have some middle school educators here, so feel free to, let me know kind of what you think, but my experiences has been, and Joe, to kind of build on your point too, is that if students don't necessarily, if they couldn't read the primary sources themselves, right? If the words kind of shared in the primary sources might include vocabulary that's too advanced, or, sometimes just the readability of primary sources, especially those written throughout history, can be really difficult and not very accessible for students, is that at least getting that emotion will convey the ideas of the primary source in a way that is relatable and understanding to the students. So a lot of teachers who I kind of share this with, especially those teachers who teach middle school, say that their students would be able to connect to it in a unique way that not necessarily just reading it would do. Laurie said using his actual words makes it powerful and giving the background information. Yeah, absolutely. A few points of the history that lead up to it and help kind of connect the dots. Right. Absolutely. And so again, in kind of reflecting back on some of those questions that we just addressed about storytelling and how essential it is, but also sometimes how difficult it can be to kind of choose which stories to share. If you're talking about abolition, right, you can talk about, women from the suffrage movement. You can talk about women like Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you can talk about those voices and John Brown and everything like that. But you can also talk about Frederick Douglass, and you can share this story as either an alternative or a complementary piece to this as well. And it just kind of frames the story in a different way and includes different voices in that kind of space too. So again, just kind of all part of this decision-making process. Anything else that we picked out, anything that really resonated with us from the clip itself? Maybe not necessarily, or, you can include anything that you think would resonate with your students, but anything that you just individually kind of picked out from it as well. I will say that I love the use of props, not just in this clip, but kind of throughout all of the other clips as well. And there was something that was really powerful about matching the props that we would see with kind of what they were sharing, right? That there was kind of something about when he talked about his family and his children, about picking up that doll, right? And as a mother with two small children, that really kind of resonated with me. Or when he was talking about his time as when he was enslaved and picking up the whip, and how kind of powerful that connection of what he's saying and what they're showing are very clear there. Ask them why they think the woman in the beginning repeated certain words. Absolutely, as he was reading the Declaration, right? What made those words so significant? Showing the dates is always helpful so students can understand the timeline. Absolutely, right? So understanding kind of how all of these things are happening around the same time and how they are kind of still in conflict with one another, and how that shifts. So those are also really important too. All right, fantastic. Thank you. And as I said before, so kind of when we're talking about not just stories, but, not just stories connected to the 14th Amendment, but stories kind of broadly connected, we often kind of deal with and what stories or artifacts or things to share, and how, what stories did they tell in the past, and what was kind of left out of those stories too. And I'm going to share my favorite story with you all, and then kind of show you an activity that you can take to your students so that they can start to relate to some of these questions and kind of, wrestle with them on their own and reflect on them as well. So one of the stories that I had mentioned beforehand, in teaching about the 14th Amendment and in all of the resources and programs that we do about the 14th Amendment, it always includes a story about Dred Scott, right? And so I had mentioned this Civil War and Reconstruction exhibit that we opened in 2019. And when we opened this, I was tasked with kind of doing some research about women during this time period, right? And so what I very quickly found out was Harriet was a particularly popular name right before the Civil War. There were all of these Harriets that I was finding. So we have Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? We have Harriet Tubman. We also had a woman named Harriet Jacobs, who was an enslaved person who ran away and hid in an attic of a house for 7 years. And then we also had Harriet Scott. And so, I had learned as a history student and taught all of this. Everybody, had heard about Dred Scott, right? But learning about Harriet Scott was a new part to this story that I found so fascinating and so exciting to share. So Harriet Scott was married to Dred. She moved around with him in the case that would eventually, or I suppose in the moves that would eventually facilitate the case. But one of the questions that was kind of surrounding the case itself was why the case was brought up when it was. And what I kind of learned through some of the research for the programs that we did was Harriet was really one of the driving forces behind bringing up their suit for freedom. And she did it because her 2 daughters, who are pictured here, were coming to be of an age where they could be sold into slavery. So their family could be separated. And so that is what kind of sparked Harriet to decide that they should sue for their freedom. So as the case, moved successfully and unsuccessfully up to the Supreme Court, Harriet's name was eventually dropped off of the suit entirely. And so eventually, when it did get to the Supreme Court, it was just associated with Dred. But what we kind of lose in that is this amazing story of a woman who decided that she was going to fight for the freedom and independence and equality of her family, as it kind of, moved through the American court system. Now, the Dred Scott decision is one of the most infamous court cases in American history, right? The decision that came out of this, penned by Chief Justice Roger Taney, said that the enslaved population, they don't have the rights that a white man is bound to respect. And that all of their rights essentially come from anything that the ruling class is willing to give to them. He said that African Americans were not citizens, nor could they ever be citizens. So they did not include, or they weren't allowed the same rights as white Americans. So, very, very volatile language that came out of this case. And as I said, it's oftentimes remembered as one of the most infamous court cases in American history. Now, the ending part of this story that I love to share is that Harriet and her 2 daughters lived to see the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So they survived past its ratification. So they eventually were able to live in a country that had a law of the land that recognized their freedom and equality in a way that this Supreme Court case did not. And so in talking about the Dred Scott decision, again, a lot of the story rightfully centers around Dred and oftentimes centers around Roger Taney. And so in reframing this story to include instead Harriet and her 2 daughters, we're allowing for different perspectives and voices to be included in this same practice. Now, all of this is connected, and I'm going to share this really quickly because I only have 2 more minutes left with everybody. All of this is connected in kind of other resources that we have. And so when we talk about the 14th Amendment, we just recently launched a Constitution 101 course. And so what this does is it has 15 modules on all parts of the, oh, I typed it wrong, that's embarrassing. All parts of the US Constitution. When we go to the module specifically about the 14th Amendment, the kind of culminating activity is a museum activity. And that's where a lot of these questions that I pose throughout the course of our brief time together, where those come from. So essentially the activity itself, you'll see a clip of 14 up here. Those are on the black codes. But the activity, please excuse me if I'm giving anybody motion sickness right now, deals with creating your own museum. So we're asking students to make some of those decisions, right? If they were going to create a museum around the 14th Amendment, whose stories would they tell and whose stories would they leave out and how would they make that decision? So again, allowing students the space to kind of make those connections, because in their exhibit space, they could talk about African Americans, they could talk about women, they could talk about LGBTQ+, they could talk about, anybody else who has been extended the privileges of, and the rights included in the 14th Amendment. And so we're telling them that we know that they need to make these decisions, but then let's talk about why they made the decisions they did, right? So this activity in and of itself allows students to engage not only with those historical stories, but the Constitution and all of those decisions that go into it, and kind of rectifying and reckoning with some of those issues that they might need to deal with. So I will make sure that I share all of those materials in the chat that I do as well after our session is over. But I know it is 1:15 my time, so I think that makes it 10:15 your time. So I want to very quickly thank you all so much for being here with me today. I'm going to send my email address through the chat, so please feel free to email me. I spelled it wrong, friends. Don't copy and paste that here. It's just sharris@constitutioncenter.org. But please feel free to email me with any questions, anything that comes into mind, any way that I can support you and your students. I am, quite frankly, it is my job to support you. So please, please, please reach out if you need me. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Saturday and enjoy the rest of your conference today. Thank you all so much, and I hope to work with you all soon. I'll see you all later. Thank you. Thank you.